Welcome to the Followup podcast. My name is Hayden. I am the worship director here at Arbor Church, and today I'm joined by Alison, our community care pastor, and Ryan Plants, our lead pastor.
And we are experiencing joy.
We're experiencing joy.
Yeah.
We started a new series. What was the name of it again?
Resilient Joy.
Oh,
Hayden.
that's right.
Yeah, you made
Okay.
the artwork for it. You should know this.
I am understanding your intro now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
So we're in a new series called Resilient Joy, which
That's
will
right.
be in for 10 weeks.
Maybe 20.
What?
Maybe 20. You just never
Maybe
know how
20.
long these things are going to go. You know?
Honestly, you'd
Yeah.
think we would know, but we don't. We're
Yeah.
just going to figure out when to stop it when it feels right. We're
Exactly.
going off vibes for this series.
Maybe we'll go through it twice.
I don't see why not. People are bound to miss a couple weeks, so
Yeah.
this is the only way to ensure
Yeah.
completion of the teaching. So
Yeah. Well, we don't think we're joyful enough yet. One more time. Here
Yep.
we go.
Let's go, guys. Not enough smiles out there, so let's run it back.
Still a little too dour.
Oh my gosh.
Um,
Arbor will not know what to do with itself being
Yeah.
in this elevated
That's the
state.
goal.
Yes. Yeah. Yep.
we want to have some sort of crisis of what's going on. So Resilient Joy, for people that don't know, is going to be our study of Philippians. We're going to go from beginning to end. And Ryan, if you wouldn't mind talking about why did we decide to choose the name Resilient Joy when we're talking about the series studying Philippians?
Well, I think, first of all, it's kind of a classic understanding of Paul's letter to the Philippians, that it's rooted in joy, that Paul is experiencing joy amidst like really dire, difficult circumstances. And so we look at Paul, we look at him as an example, and we look at what he's written to the Philippians, and we see this roadmap to joy. But like I said, he's in prison, and there's a sense of resiliency about it. And so we put those two words together, and we got Resilient Joy. And that's the title of the series.
Wow. One of the things that I think we've joked around about as a staff when it comes to resilient joy is also the idea of something that we should be aware of, right? Toxic positivity, right? And I don't recall. Did you kind of talk about that in your message yesterday?
No, but we can talk about it right now.
Yeah, I
a
think
little
that's
bit.
kind of important for us to address a little bit. I'm assuming that we're all kind of up to speed on toxic positivity, but maybe Alison, do you want to take a stab at it for anyone who doesn't really know what we're talking about when we mention that?
I think when people refer to toxic positivity, it seems like you're rushing to the silver lining and you're rushing to put a bow on anything that's hard, and you're wanting to wrap it up and just look for the positive thing. Like, well, at least they didn't suffer too long. 8 months with cancer, that's pretty great. And people are like, wow, man. Or could you also say cancer's hard and not have to rush to say, oh, it's only 8 months.
Yeah.
That's great. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like it's the positive feeling is rooted in that silver lining reframing.
Yes.
And I think that's the toxic part of that kind of happiness.
I think people are uncomfortable with pain and they want to rush past it to make you feel better, the pain bearer.
Yeah.
But as a result, what you're doing is you're missing part of the experience of suffering. If all of you do is spray glitter all over something, you're not really addressing the human heart, which has a spectrum of feeling in it. It's not all just glitter.
Yeah.
So.
And I think it's an important thing to talk about given our church's history and context. We have never been afraid to dive into grief or sadness or just hard issues. But when we talk about something like resilient joy, it is something to have some context of we should have resilient joy. This is how we go about it. This is an example of it. But also there is the air of if we don't do things right, this is how things can look and manifest. So I think we should just hop into the message. I thought one of the things that kind of came to mind when I was putting the slides together on Saturday was you had quite a few quotes from different authors and books. And I really appreciated, I'm trying to find it in your manuscript right here, but I mean, the opening quote was really, really good. And I thought it was a good, framework to kind of lay out the opening message when you talked about languish and languishing. And I kind of wanted to just ask, where did you find some of these quotes from, these different authors that you brought in?
So, Adam Grant, that was an article he wrote in the New York Times. It's actually based on a study that was done 20 years ago in 2002 on the concept of languishing. And so in the mental health world, the continuum, I think, is more languishing to flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
And it puts a different word to that kind of stuckness or malaise that people feel. And so that was a New York Times article. I think it came out in April of 2021. And Adam Grant is organizational psychologist, kind of dabbles in that pop psychology world. You know, you follow him on Instagram. He has a lot of great, here's how to have a healthy organization.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd been listening to his podcast for a while and came across that article. I think I follow him on Twitter.
Yeah.
And then there's a quote from a theologian in a commentary, Anthony Lee Ash.
Yep.
He's a theologian and Bible scholar. And then the J.R. Tolkien one was, I think, a search on joy quotes.
Yeah.
That's not from any of his Lord of the Rings series. It's like a letter or something that he wrote.
Well, that quote from J.R. Tolkien reminded me of one of my favorite worship song lyrics is a song by John McMillan, and he says, "There's a cup of joy for every taste of sorrow." And I thought that was like very similar points being made right there.
Sure.
But you started out with those three big quotes that I thought kind of set the framework of contrasting joy with grief or sorrow or pain or languishing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which I thought was, I think, a really good way to kind of not send us down that route of toxic positivity and show, okay, these are different things, and using it with a backdrop of, the opposite of joy, if you might say. So I thought that it was nice to just kind of build that foundation, say we're not going to be oblivious to pain and sorrow. We're not just going to say, let's be happy and avoid feelings. And then we got to kind of hop into the beginning of Philippians, which we had talked about on staff. Even we were talking about reading scripture from the stage of like, is it important for us to start out with the preamble? Like, can we just skip into verse 3? Which I think you showed the importance of not skipping through that. If you want to talk more on the importance you found in the first couple verses of Philippians.
Yeah, totally. I'll back up a little bit and just say, as we wrap up the toxic positivity conversation, I think the idea there at the very beginning, at the very outset of this series, is that joy can exist concurrently with pain.
Yeah.
In fact, I think what people can attest to is some of our most, some of our deepest experiences with joy are in those moments of sorrow and peace, or sorrow and grief. I think that it's rooted in something different. That's what I really liked about that Anthony Lee Ash quote, is that it's not about a mood. We're not talking about joy isn't in the spectrum of like sorrow and sadness and happiness. And it's what Paul is getting at when he talks about joy. It's something deeper. It's like this abiding sense of wellness, and maybe you could say shalom, that sense of peace that leads to flourishing even amidst highly, highly difficult circumstances. And so it's to me something of a mystery still as to how that can be the case, because in my mind it's like when good things are happening you feel good, and when bad things are happening you feel bad. And I do think that's true, but I think undergirding all of that, what we see in the scriptures is this deeper abiding sense of joy, of wellness in the Lord, regardless of what's happening circumstantially. But to then go into those first two verses. What was your question again?
Well, I just wanted to go back to that Anthony Lee Ash quote real fast, because I really enjoyed the line, "Emotional fluctuations will not trouble this source of joy."
Exactly. Yeah.
Because
that's
that joy is grounded in something deeper. But I just wanted to going back to the original question. We had talked on staff about should we just jump right into it at verse 3, and then we kind of talked about, is there something to be taught or learned from the first couple verses? And you had actually spent a decent amount of time of that in your message of talking about the introduction. So for people that maybe weren't there on Sunday, what were some of the insights that you found in those first couple verses? Primarily, you talked about Paul identifying himself as a slave.
Yeah. In those first couple of verses, again, like you think like, well, I'll skip over them. There's nothing really too important
Mhm.
going on here. But what we have to remember is everything in these letters is like very intentional. And so there's a reason why Paul wrote under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit that like introduction.
Mhm.
And even like not to like overly spiritualize it, like Paul was a smart guy. And like he's writing his letter and he knows what he's doing when he's framing up his conversation. Not just like IQ intelligent, but like EQ intelligent. He knew the situation he was writing from, writing to. And so he knew what would be appropriate in that moment. And so in those first couple of verses, instead of, you know, introducing himself, well, not really introducing himself, like most of the people would have known him,
Yeah.
but like labeling himself as Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, called by the will of God, like what we see in Corinthians, he just says slave. And so like you
Mhm.
have to ask yourself the question, Paul, this like prolific writer letter and pastor of churches and planter of churches,
Mhm.
why would he choose that title
Mhm.
for this letter? And it's, I mean, you just find once you start to like go down a trail like that and you start reading all these other books about Philippians, like there's a reason.
Mhm.
There's a reason for that. And it's because Paul is setting himself up as this model or example. And we see it in Philippians 3:17. He says, follow my example as I follow after Christ. Okay, well then, Paul, what's important about this identity as a slave or a servant or bondservant or whatever your translation says, doulos in the original Greek?
Mm. Yeah. So after you got into that in the message, you then kind of brought up the first question that was kind of, I don't want to say frame or structure of it, but you said, "What is my posture?" And you got into the kind of talking about that. When did that language come in when you were putting together the sermon? Was that pretty early on, or was that later in the sermon development process?
Well, what we're doing now is the Tuesday, about, I don't know how many days out that is, like 12 days out
Yeah.
now, 12 days out from the Sunday it'll be preached. We meet as a staff on Tuesday afternoons to talk through the passage, to make some observations. And it was there that we kind of started to flesh out,
Yeah.
what Paul is getting at here is kind of this posture idea of like, we're asking ourselves the question,
Mhm.
why is Paul experiencing this joy?
Yeah.
And so you're like trying to make these observations about him, and you're sort of seeing here, well, here's this first thing, like his heart's posture amidst trial and amidst suffering. And where do we see that? Well, we see that in him expressing himself as a slave, not like church planter or former Torah scholar or anything like that. Like that's his identity. And so then we ask ourselves the question, how can we experience that joy as well? Well, in this posture thing, like we have to ask ourselves, maybe I'm not experiencing the kind of joy that the Lord has on offer for me
Mhm.
because the posture of my heart is all jacked up.
Yeah. Mm. You had after the posture of our hearts, you'd moved into the idea of self-importance and the relationship self-importance has to our joy and our resilient joy, right? I'm curious because I believe I was a part of this Tuesday sermon. I might have been late to this one, to that meeting, but I don't remember the self-importance conversation making its way in, at least when I was there for the meeting. When did that relationship develop in the study of the text of, okay, self-importance kind of does combat our joy?
Yeah, I mean, did we talk about that at all in that sermon?
I don't think we talked about it in that whiteboard.
Yeah.
It was more posture, perspective, and promises or something.
Sure,
I was trying to go after those P's.
Yeah.
Because I think that it really, like, after looking through the manuscript, putting the slides together, hearing it on Sunday, it does really connect of, if you have this overinflated sense of self-importance, it does definitely combat your joy. So when did that make its way into the process?
I think in the process of writing a message, you ask yourself, like, okay, here's what's being put forward. What's preventing me from experiencing that?
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't think it's not like a big brain move or anything. It's just more like okay, this is what's being presented. What's the opposite of that? You know? And in my mind, it was self-importance, or it was what's the opposite of someone who has this like humble attitude of service and submission? It's someone who's self-important.
Yeah.
And so Are there other things that prevent us from experiencing like that posture of servanthood? Probably. I think so. But just to call out one aspect of our hearts,
Yeah.
that idea of self-importance, I think was the thing that kind of rose to the top.
And I think we even forecasted we're going to be hearing much more about throughout the rest of the book. We're going to be hearing much more about posture and perspective as
Yeah.
we go forward. So I hope that it will become language that's so familiar to us and so internalized that when we have a lack of resilient joy in our lives, we're able to like harken back to this series and go, oh yeah, right. What is my posture? Am I self-important? Am I, not grateful? Am I, whatever? Like there could be a checklist.
Yeah.
I'm always going after sort of that formulaic, like, give me the formula for joy.
Yeah.
Even though
Sure.
there is so much mystery associated with it, like you said, I do think there are some things that we can do to set ourselves up for the best environment possible for joy to enter.
Oh, totally.
So-
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into the next point of what is my perspective. We go from posture and self-importance and how we look at things, or not necessarily look at things, but how we set ourselves up to experience things. And now it's the visual, right? The perspective. How do I see things? This was one of the things that had came from the Tuesday meeting perspective, correct? Okay.
Oh yeah.
And I thought it was interesting because right after perspective is where you get into the pink elephant, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. And I think that was a really, it was fun. It was a fun analogy or exercise to do, but it was also very insightful, right? To have that. All right, I want you guys to close your eyes. Think. You told them not to think about a pink elephant, right? Yeah. Don't think about the pink elephant. Don't do this. And then revealing to everybody, like, when that is your perspective in the environment that you're in, that's all you can do. And I feel like go ahead. Did I just hear? Oh, sorry. I think
I heard something. Yeah.
I was turning a page and I thought I heard one of you guys talk. I'm just curious, when we're talking about perspective, one of the things you said, a way of life that fixes its focus on our partnership with others of Jesus and promises of God, not just our problems. Really easy to say, but very difficult to do in practice, right?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was the idea was, again, as I'm trying to think through like writing this message, I'm honestly just asking myself the questions. Like, I'm not trying to think through like, well, what do people struggle with? I'm honestly just thinking like,
Look in the mirror.
I'm just like, I'm looking in the mirror and I'm like, oh yeah, like, how do I make that switch? How do I make that shift? And where are my hangups and where are my struggles in shifting my perspective? Because I would say I am a glass is probably half empty kind of person. Maybe I don't present like that, but like I'm always, not always, I don't want to use 100% word, but like I frequently look at the situation and I'm like, what could go wrong here? Or like, what is wrong? Like that kind of critic or like kind of worried about what could go wrong. And so what we see again, so those words that you just read were again, like drawn from the text, or the idea is drawn from the text, that what Paul is focused on is Paul's focused on his partnership with the Philippians, like that's bringing him great joy, and the promises of God. Philippians 1:6, he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Christ Jesus. And so like, but then again, you have that question, like, why is he looking at those things, and why are those the things that are like driving him? Whereas like me in my life, like I'm focusing on my problems. I'm focusing on these things. Well, Brian, stop focusing on those problems. And then like the more you like tell yourself to stop focusing on those problems, then you're feeling bad about like focusing on the problems. And then you're like, well, now stop feeling bad about, and it's just kind of like this death spiral. And so it's like, well, what's the key? And my eyes were then drawn to like Paul's heart of gratitude. And I think it's pretty well known that gratitude is a driving force for joy. And so, but you see it though there in Philippians. Like Paul's like, he starts in verse 3, like, I give thanks for you every time you come to mind, and I pray for you. And so clearly there's some secret sauce there, right? Like gratitude, like how can I be more grateful? And perhaps that's the beginning of the perspective shift. I don't think it's the full thing, like Alison was saying. I think all of chapter 1 is about perspective. And we'll see that in this coming week in verses 12 through 17, 18. We see it, majorly in 18 through 30. That Paul just has this way of divine perspective. He doesn't see things the way we would see things from our own human perspective. He sees them the way God would see them. And so, but I think it starts with gratitude, but there's more to it, I think, as well.
I think people who practice gratitude, it's a discipline, so people who practice that discipline report back on increased satisfaction with their lives, and their perspective is changed forever once they start that practice
Oh, totally.
of seeing it through God's eyes best as they can. And obviously there's a work of the Holy Spirit involved with that in terms of revelation of his perspective to you. But I can think of my mom. She was an example of gratitude. She kept a gratitude journal, and it retrained the way that she saw her day, retrained the way that she would see encounters throughout the day, and some of the things that just occurred. She learned to flip it in the moment instead of just at the end of the day when she was recounting her day and then trying to be grateful for those things. She was able then, the discipline of gratitude shaped her in a way that in the moment she was able to then kind of see it through God's eyes. And it wasn't in a toxic positivity kind of way. She was a very real woman too. So, but I long for that, not just at the end of the day when you're doing like your prayer of examine or your grateful list as you're falling asleep and trying to like tame the anxiety monster,
Mm-hmm.
but more like in the moment, like
Mm-hmm.
being grateful every hour of the day.
Oh, that's really good. Yeah. I mean, you're right when you say it's a discipline. It is a discipline of gratitude. And I think that's an important thing in this pursuit of joy, is that it really is a choice. It is a choice. It's not some sort of circumstantial thing that you happen upon. It's a choice, and that choice to be grateful. And I think what it says about, I think what it communicates is it communicates a reality or a truth about God, that there are things to be grateful for, because our God is a good God who is the giver of every good and perfect gift. And he is not so like stingy and like trying to like make our lives miserable and awful. And like, yeah, like, do we live in a broken world where we experience hardship? And not even like major things, but just like, oh, the day's getting long and I'm tired. And like, why do I have to wake up every day and work and go to this job? Again, I don't think we're reframing that to be like toxically positive. But I think there's so much about it that we can still be grateful for, and acknowledge in a way that's like truly holy. And it's a discipline. And I think what it communicates is a faith in a good God who, as Paul said, like he's the one who started the work. He didn't make a mistake. He's gonna complete it. But it's a choice. It's a choice. And I think it's like the first choice we have to make.
Mm-hmm. That section was one of my favorite parts of your message yesterday on Sunday. Where you talked about his desire for them, or his reminder for them, was written in a different font, as how you described it.
Yeah.
And I forget, was it just the grammar of that sentence construction at that
so
point?
do we want to nerd out real quick in
I like
Greek
that.
language
Yeah.
real quick? So English language is called a subject verb object language, and so our word order is tremendously important. We can identify the subject in a sentence by order. So like Ryan threw the ball, right? Like that's a subject, a verb, and an object. In the Greek language, it's totally different. It's not a SVO language, as they call it. It's based on case. So you can put the words, all that to say, you can put the words in different order. And so that word order matters frequently when you're looking at a sentence. And so he starts the sentence with the verb, or it's actually a participle, but he starts it with that. And so like, not only that, but it's the pepoithos is the verb. It's a
Yeah, I was going to
participle.
say that. Were you going to
Yeah.
say that too?
Mhm.
Hayden?
That was on the tip of my tongue. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's and when he front loads the sentence with that, it indicates like having or being convinced. When that is at the front end, it's like something important is happening here. It is like a signifier, and it's essentially like if a preacher is like saying like, okay, listen up, like it's a device to kind of get their attention, because we have to remember these letters were being read over a congregation, that local church. And so when the letter reader would have been reading it and they would have hit that, there probably would have been like special emphasis on that word, and then they would have gotten that promise, that really important promise in verse 6 that Paul was like front loading the letter with, so that they would know in the moment. So that's a little Greek nerd out lesson.
Yeah.
Right
And
there.
it's such a beautiful thing to emphasize to a congregation, right? Like you think
Totally.
of somebody's words from prison, he's thinking, I don't know, this could be my last letter to you. Here's the thing I really want you to take away
Mhm.
and know for, forever.
Yeah.
The rest of your life, know this thing.
Mm.
Yes.
Just
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah.
Like the closing of Paul's life, we're coming to the close of the podcast.
It's just flown by.
Wow,
Yeah.
amazing
you know?
segue.
Yeah.
Hayden.
Is there anything else we should chat about before we close things out? We're in the prison element of our podcast. Right now, so.
Any final questions or thoughts, Alison?
Oh, let's see. Well, shout out to Knowledge of the Holy.
Oh yeah, great book.
That was a great book. I was excited to hear you reference it.
Yeah, I would say if you're listening at the end of this podcast now and you're like, what book should I read right now? One of the questions that I asked in the message was, when you think of God, like what comes to mind? The Knowledge of the Holy is like, it's really small. The chapters are like 1.5 to 3 pages each. A.W. Tozer. And it just does such a good job of like distilling the attributes and nature of God in a way where I think it just inspires worship and inspires faith in who God is, because we think we understand who God is, especially if we've been walking with Jesus for any length of time. And so like a practical step of application out of this is, if you're like, man, like I just really want to delight in the presence of God, but he feels far away or I don't know where he's at, pick up that book. And you could honestly like sit down and read it in one setting, or like really soak it in like day by day, just kind of read an attribute a day, and your socks will be totally blown off.
Oh, I loved it.
Yeah.
I love that book.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah, and if you're looking for another book to read, we as a church are reading through Philippians.
Yes.
We have these
Yeah.
bookmarks.
Yeah, and one last, we have those bookmarks that we handed out, and if you ended up grabbing one of those bookmarks and you were like, what is this bookmark for? We want to read through Philippians together as a church. And so each and every week, we're going to read through the passage that was taught on that Sunday. And you're probably wondering, the 3 check boxes. Do I read it 3 times a day?
I thought those were just squares.
Do I read what's that?
I just thought they were squares. Thanks for telling me they're
Yeah,
checkboxes.
or are they just sort of decorative? Do I
Yeah.
read 3 times an hour?
Yeah.
No, read, the aim was to read it 3 times a week. Whatever the passage was, just
Yeah.
read it 3 times a week, so we can really be reading this together.
Yep.
And not just kind of encountering it for a brief 30 minutes on Sunday morning, but really be ministered to by God's word throughout the week.
Avant-garde teaching,
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. Well, anything else before we close the podcast out? All
Nope.
right.
That's it.
Well, thank you guys for listening and watching the Followup podcast. We hope to see you guys for week 2 of Resilient Joy, and make sure to read. And thank you guys so much. We'll see you guys next week.